April 10, 1901, Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston. Dr. Duncan MacDougall's hands steadied the beam balance as the patient's breathing slowed. The scale, custom-built to his specifications, was sensitive to 0.2 of an ounce, approximately 5.6 grams. The entire apparatus, bed and patient included, rested on the platform. The needle held steady at 3 hours, 40 minutes and 30 seconds. The patient, a man dying of tuberculosis, took his final breath. The needle moved, 3/4 of an ounce gone, vanished. In the span between the final heartbeat and the stillness that followed, this cannot be measurement error. No physiological process accounts for this. MacDougall watched the scale for 15 minutes, waiting for any reversal, any correction. The weight did not return. He checked for moisture loss through perspiration. None sufficient to explain the deficit. He examined the apparatus for mechanical failure. The scale functioned perfectly. He calculated heat loss through radiation, negligible over such a short time frame. Something measurable had left the body at the moment of death, something with mass, something that could be weighed. Dr. Duncan MacDougall, a respected physician with practices in Haverhill and Boston, had just completed the first of 6 experiments that would define his legacy and consume his remaining years. What captured his complete attention, what would make him a figure of both scientific curiosity and professional ridicule, was the implication contained within that single measurement. If something with mass departed the body at death, if that something could be quantified and measured, if the loss occurred at the precise instant of expiration, then perhaps, just perhaps, he had found physical evidence of the human soul. The assumption underlying this conclusion would prove catastrophically flawed. The methodology would be demolished by peers. The results would fail replication. The entire experimental framework would be exposed as scientifically invalid, but the idea, once introduced, would prove impossible to eliminate. The 21 grams, the weight of the soul, it would persist for more than a century, embedded in popular consciousness, referenced in films and literature, believed by millions who never read MacDougall's original paper or understood why the scientific community rejected his conclusions absolutely. The journey to this moment had begun years earlier in the intersection between 2 contradictory movements that defined turn-of-the-century American intellectual life: scientific materialism and spiritualism. By 1900, materialism had achieved cultural dominance in American medicine and science. The body was a machine. Disease resulted from material causes: bacteria, viruses, chemical imbalances, structural abnormalities. Treatment addressed physical mechanisms. The great medical breakthroughs of the late 19th century, germ theory, antiseptic surgery, vaccines, all reinforced the materialist framework. There was no need to invoke spiritual explanations for phenomena that could be understood through material processes. Yet simultaneously, spiritualism was experiencing unprecedented popularity. Seances were fashionable in respectable homes. Mediums claimed contact with the deceased. Psychical research societies investigated paranormal phenomena. Even prominent scientists, including physicists like William Crookes and psychologists like William James, entertained the possibility that consciousness might persist beyond bodily death. The contradiction was fundamental. If consciousness was entirely material, if mind was simply what brain does, then death ended consciousness absolutely. But if spiritualism had any validity, if mediums genuinely contacted the deceased, then consciousness must be something more than neural activity, something capable of existing independently of physical substrate. Duncan MacDougall believed he could resolve this contradiction through measurement. If the soul existed, if consciousness persisted beyond death, then the soul must have physical properties. It must occupy space. It must possess mass. And if it possessed mass, then its departure at death would produce measurable weight loss. The logic was superficially compelling. It offered empirical methodology for investigating metaphysical questions. It promised to bridge the gap between science and spiritualism through quantitative evidence. It suggested that ancient religious and philosophical concepts about the soul might be scientifically verifiable. The logic was also completely wrong. But that wrongness would not become apparent to MacDougall or his supporters until after the experiments were complete and the results published. MacDougall's experimental design was straightforward. Obtain a specially constructed scale capable of measuring weight changes of 0.2 of an ounce. Place a dying patient on the scale. Monitor weight continuously through the death process. Record any weight change occurring at the moment of death. Compare results across multiple subjects to identify consistent patterns. The challenge was finding suitable subjects. MacDougall needed patients who were dying but conscious, whose deaths could be predicted with sufficient accuracy to allow preparation of equipment, who would die in institutional settings where the scale could be installed, whose families would consent to such unusual experimental procedures. Tuberculosis patients met these criteria. The disease was common in 1901, affecting approximately 200 out of every 100,000 Americans. The terminal phase was predictable, lasting hours to days. Patients remained conscious almost until death. And most importantly for MacDougall's purposes, tuberculosis patients typically died in hospitals or sanatoriums where experimental equipment could be installed. Between 1901 and 1907, MacDougall conducted 6 experiments. The details appeared in his paper published in American Medicine in April 1907, titled Hypothesis Concerning Soul Substance, together with experimental evidence of the existence of such substance. The first subject tested on April 10, 1901, was the man whose death MacDougall witnessed at Massachusetts General Hospital. The weight loss occurred suddenly at death, 0.75 of an ounce, approximately 21.3 grams. MacDougall recorded every detail: the patient's position on the scale, the sensitivity of the apparatus, the absence of confounding factors like perspiration or bowel evacuation, the precision of the timing. The second subject, tested several months later, showed no weight change at death, none. The scale remained steady before, during, and after expiration. MacDougall attributed this to the scale malfunctioning, though he provided no evidence of mechanical failure. He simply concluded that this trial was invalid and excluded it from his analysis. The third subject showed weight loss of 14.1 grams occurring 1 minute after death, not at the moment of death itself. MacDougall explained this delay by theorizing that some souls departed slowly rather than instantaneously. The explanation was convenient but entirely ad hoc, invented to accommodate data that contradicted his hypothesis. The fourth subject showed weight loss of 10.6 grams at death, followed by an additional loss of 28.3 grams several minutes later. MacDougall interpreted this as evidence that the soul departed in stages, though he offered no mechanism or explanation for why this would occur. The fifth and sixth subjects provided results too inconsistent for MacDougall to interpret confidently. One showed minimal weight loss, the other showed fluctuations that might have been measurement error or might have represented actual weight changes. MacDougall included them in his paper but acknowledged their ambiguity. The results were, to put it generously, inconclusive. 6 trials produced 6 different outcomes: 21.3 grams, no change; 14.1 grams with delay; 10.6 grams with secondary loss; ambiguous minimal loss; and ambiguous fluctuations. There was no consistent pattern, no replicable finding, no clear relationship between death and weight loss. Yet MacDougall concluded that he had demonstrated the existence of the soul. He averaged the measurable weight losses from the trials he considered valid: 21.3, 14.1, and 10.6 grams. The mean was 15.3 grams. He acknowledged the wide variation but argued that individual souls might differ in weight just as bodies differ in weight. He claimed the experiments provided preliminary evidence that consciousness possessed mass and departed the body at death. The paper concluded with MacDougall's call for further research. The The net result of the experiments conducted on human beings is that a loss of weight of approximately 3/4 of an ounce, or from 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce, occurs under the experimental conditions described at death, that is, at the moment when respiration ceases and the heart stops beating. He was claiming far more certainty than his data supported. He was interpreting ambiguous results as definitive evidence. He was dismissing negative findings as equipment malfunction while accepting positive findings without equivalent scrutiny. Every aspect of his analysis revealed confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret data in ways that support pre-existing beliefs. But MacDougall was not finished. If the soul possessed mass, if it departed at human death, then the same phenomenon should not occur in animals. This was crucial for MacDougall's theory. Religious and philosophical traditions distinguished between human souls and animal consciousness. If his experiments showed weight loss in animals equivalent to humans, his interpretation collapsed. The weight loss would be explicable through purely physiological processes rather than departure of an immaterial soul. MacDougall conducted experiments on 15 dogs. He killed them by poison while they rested on the same scale used for human subjects. He monitored their weight continuously through the death process. None of the dogs showed weight loss at death. The scale remained steady throughout. MacDougall interpreted this as confirming that humans possessed souls while dogs did not, that the weight loss in humans represented something unique to human consciousness. The dog experiments were published in American Medicine in 1907 alongside the human experiments. MacDougall was confident he had demonstrated what philosophers had debated for millennia, empirical proof that human consciousness transcended physical death. The response from the scientific community was immediate and devastating. Dr. Augustus P. Clarke, a physician practicing in Boston, published a response in American Medicine within weeks of MacDougall's paper. Clarke systematically demolished every aspect of MacDougall's methodology and conclusions. The scale's sensitivity was inadequate. Weight changes of less than 1 ounce were at the limit of the apparatus's resolution. Any environmental factor, air currents, temperature gradients, moisture changes, could produce fluctuations in that range. The sample size was absurdly small, 6 human subjects with 3 producing ambiguous or contradictory results could not support any generalized conclusion. No legitimate scientific finding had ever been established on such limited evidence. The lack of controls invalidated the entire experiment. MacDougall had not measured weight changes in living subjects over equivalent time periods. He had not controlled for temperature. He had not accounted for air moisture. He had not isolated the apparatus from vibration or air movement. Any of these factors could explain the observed weight variations. The timing was suspect. MacDougall claimed weight loss occurred at the moment of death, but determining the precise instant of death was impossible with 1901 medical technology. Respiration ceases gradually, not instantly. Cardiac activity shows complex patterns during terminal decline. Brain death occurs over minutes, not seconds. There was no single moment of death that could be correlated with weight change. The dog experiments were methodologically different from the human experiments. Dogs were killed by poison while humans died from disease. Dogs were held down forcibly while humans lay voluntarily. The experimental conditions were not comparable, making any comparison of results scientifically meaningless. Most damning, Clarke explained the weight loss through conventional physiology. At death, thermoregulation ceases. The body no longer maintains constant temperature. Cooling begins immediately. As the body cools, moisture evaporates from lungs and skin. This evaporation produces measurable weight loss that continues for hours after death. MacDougall's scale was measuring evaporative water loss, not departure of an immaterial soul. Clarke's calculation was straightforward. The human body at death contains residual heat. This heat drives evaporation of water from moist surfaces, lungs, mouth, skin. Evaporation of 21 grams of water requires approximately 50 kilojoules of energy, well within the thermal energy contained in a cooling human body. The weight loss MacDougall measured was entirely explicable through physics and physiology. No metaphysical explanation was necessary or appropriate. Other physicians and scientists added their critiques. The Journal of the American Medical Association published skeptical commentary. The New York Times covered the controversy, noting that scientific consensus rejected MacDougall's conclusions. Medical journals in Britain and Europe dismissed the experiments as methodologically flawed and theoretically unsound. But the criticism revealed a deeper problem with MacDougall's entire approach. Even if his measurements had been accurate, even if the weight loss occurred consistently at death, even if all methodological problems were resolved, the experiments still could not prove what MacDougall claimed they proved. The fundamental error was a category mistake. Physical properties like mass apply to physical objects. If consciousness is non-physical, if the soul is immaterial, then by definition it cannot possess mass. Weighing something presupposes it is the kind of thing that can be weighed. An immaterial soul, by definition, would not register on any scale regardless of its sensitivity. MacDougall's experiments were attempting to measure something that, if it existed as traditionally conceived, could not be measured. The metaphysical concept of an immaterial soul and the physical property of mass are mutually incompatible. Either the soul is material, in which case it's not the soul as understood by religious and philosophical traditions, or it's immaterial, in which case it cannot be weighed. This logical problem made MacDougall's entire experimental program incoherent from the start. He was trying to subject metaphysical claims to empirical testing, but the claims themselves precluded empirical investigation. It was like trying to weigh justice or measure the color of Tuesday. The categories were mismatched in ways that made the experiment nonsensical, regardless of technical execution. MacDougall never acknowledged this fundamental error. He spent his remaining years defending his experiments, publishing additional papers, attempting to refine his methodology. He proposed more sensitive scales. He suggested controlled environments. He called for institutional support for expanded research. He insisted that his critics misunderstood his methods and misinterpreted his results. But no institution provided funding. No other researchers replicated his experiments. No medical journal accepted his subsequent papers for publication. Duncan MacDougall's soul-weighing experiments became a historical footnote, a curiosity referenced in discussions of pseudoscience and methodological failures in early 20th century medicine. MacDougall died in 1920 at age 54. His obituaries made no mention of the soul experiments. His medical colleagues remembered him as a competent physician who had unfortunately pursued a line of research that damaged his professional reputation. The experiments he considered his greatest achievement were viewed by peers as his greatest embarrassment. The scientific rejection was absolute and permanent. No subsequent research has validated MacDougall's findings. Modern understanding of death processes explains weight changes through well-established physiological mechanisms, evaporative water loss, release of gases from body cavities, thermal effects, all produce measurable weight changes that continue for hours after death. Studies using far more sensitive instruments than MacDougall's scale have measured these changes precisely. The weight loss is gradual, not sudden. It correlates with cooling rate, not with any specific moment of death. It occurs in all organisms, human and animal, exactly as physiology predicts. There is no discontinuous weight loss at death, no sudden departure of measurable substance, no empirical evidence for MacDougall's soul hypothesis. Yet the idea persisted, the 21 grams. The weight of the soul. It entered popular culture and remained there despite scientific rejection. The number itself is misleading. MacDougall's 6 experiments produced no consistent value. The 21 grams figure comes from a single trial, the first experiment in April 1901. The other valid measurements were 14.1 and 10.6 grams. Averaging these gives approximately 15 grams, not 21. The 21 grams that became culturally iconic represents the least reliable approach to interpreting MacDougall's already unreliable data, but accuracy mattered less than narrative appeal. The idea of weighable souls, of consciousness possessing measurable mass, of science validating ancient metaphysical concepts was too compelling for facts to displace. The stories spread through popular media, appearing in newspapers, magazines, books. Each retelling simplified the science and amplified the dramatic elements until 21 grams became cultural shorthand for the soul's existence. The persistence of MacDougall's claim reveals something important about how scientific ideas interact with cultural beliefs. When a scientific finding, even a discredited finding, aligns with pre-existing hopes or beliefs, it can achieve cultural permanence regardless of scientific validity. People wanted evidence that consciousness transcended death. MacDougall's experiments seemed to provide that evidence. The fact that the evidence was methodologically flawed, theoretically incoherent, and scientifically rejected mattered less than the psychological comfort the idea provided. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Discredited scientific claims persist in popular consciousness when they validate emotionally appealing beliefs. Therapeutic touch, facilitated communication, polygraphy, countless examples of rejected science maintaining cultural influence long after scientific consensus has moved on. The cultural persistence of the 21 grams myth demonstrates the limits of scientific authority. Scientists can reject claims, explain methodological flaws, demonstrate why conclusions are invalid. But if the claim serves psychological or cultural functions, if it provides comfort or meaning or validation, then no amount of scientific rebuttal will eliminate it from popular consciousness. MacDougall's experiments also illustrate the dangers of confirmation bias in research. He entered the experiments believing souls existed and possessed mass. Every ambiguous result was interpreted to support this belief. Weight loss at death confirmed the hypothesis. Weight loss, delayed, after death confirmed the hypothesis with additional theorizing about slow-departing souls. Secondary weight losses confirmed multi-stage soul departure. Absence of weight loss was attributed to equipment failure rather than negative results. At no point did MacDougall seriously consider that his hypothesis might be wrong. He never designed tests that could falsify his claims. He never acknowledged that alternative explanations might account for his observations. He exemplified what philosopher Karl Popper would later identify as the defining characteristic of pseudoscience: unfalsifiability. MacDougall's sole hypothesis could accommodate any result, explain any outcome, adjust to any data. This flexibility made it scientifically worthless. Legitimate science requires that theories make predictions that can be tested and potentially disproven. MacDougall's theory made no such predictions. It simply interpreted whatever happened as confirmation. This is not how knowledge advances. This is how superstitions persist. The ethical dimensions of MacDougall's experiments deserve examination. He conducted invasive measurements on dying patients during their final moments. He transformed death, typically a private experience shared with family, into a laboratory observation session with equipment and documentation. He subjected vulnerable people to experimental procedures without clear therapeutic benefit. The consent process, if it occurred at all, is not documented in MacDougall's papers. He does not describe how he approached patients or families about participation. He does not explain what information subjects received about the experiment's purpose or methodology. He does not discuss whether subjects understood that participation served no medical purpose and might interfere with conventional end-of-life care. By modern standards, MacDougall's experiments would be considered grossly unethical. Contemporary research ethics require informed consent, clear therapeutic benefit or minimal risk, respect for subject autonomy and dignity, especially for vulnerable populations like the terminally ill. MacDougall's experiments met none of these standards, but in 1901 research ethics as a formal discipline did not exist. The Nuremberg Code would not be formulated until 1947. The Declaration of Helsinki came in 1964. Institutional review boards emerged in the 1970s. MacDougall operated in an era when physicians had enormous discretion in experimental procedures and minimal accountability for research conduct. This does not excuse the ethical problems, but provides historical context. MacDougall was not violating established research ethics standards because such standards had not yet been established. His experiments were problematic by contemporary values, but not necessarily scandalous by the standards of his time. Yet even by 1901 standards, some physicians found MacDougall's experiments troubling. Augustus Clarke's critique focused on methodology, but other commentators raised ethical concerns about conducting experiments on dying patients, about transforming death into laboratory observation, about potential disrespect for human dignity in the experimental design. These concerns reflected broader anxieties about scientific materialism. As medicine became increasingly technical and impersonal, as disease was reduced to biological mechanisms, as treatment focused exclusively on physical interventions, some physicians worried that medicine was losing sight of the human dimensions of suffering and death. MacDougall's experiments, whatever their scientific merit, seemed to exemplify this dehumanizing tendency. Ironically, MacDougall believed his experiments vindicated spiritual perspectives against reductive materialism. He thought he was providing scientific evidence for consciousness transcending physical death. But his critics saw something different. A physician so focused on measurement and quantification that he turned dying patients into experimental subjects, that he approached death as a data-gathering opportunity rather than a profound human experience. The legacy of Duncan MacDougall is complex and contradictory. He failed, scientifically. His experiments were methodologically flawed, his conclusions unjustified, his theory incoherent. The scientific community rejected his work absolutely and permanently, yet he succeeded culturally. The 21 grams concept persists in popular consciousness. Films reference it, books explore it. People who know nothing about MacDougall or his experiments still believe the soul weighs 21 grams. The discredited science became enduring mythology. This contradiction reveals something fundamental about how humans process information about death and consciousness. We are, unavoidably, emotionally invested in beliefs about what happens when we die. Questions about consciousness, soul, and persistence beyond death are not abstract, intellectual puzzles. They are existential concerns that affect how we understand our own existence and mortality. When someone offers scientific evidence, even poor scientific evidence, that consciousness transcends death, we are predisposed to accept it. The evidence confirms what we hope is true. We are less critical, less skeptical, less rigorous in evaluating claims that validate our desires. And MacDougall's experiments succeeded not because they were good science, but because they told a comforting story. They suggested that consciousness was more than neural activity, that death was not final, that some essential part of us persisted beyond bodily cessation. These ideas have ancient roots in religious and philosophical traditions. MacDougall seemed to provide modern scientific validation for ancient hopes. The fact that he failed, that his science was bad, that his conclusions were unjustified, mattered less than the psychological comfort his story provided. People wanted to believe in weighable souls. MacDougall gave them permission to believe, and once belief is established, it proves remarkably resistant to contradiction. The comparison with legitimate consciousness research highlights how far MacDougall was from scientific investigation. During the early 20th century, genuine progress was being made in understanding consciousness through proper neuroscientific methods. Santiago Ramón y Cajal was mapping neural architecture with unprecedented precision, demonstrating that the nervous system comprised individual cells rather than continuous tissue. His work, which earned the Nobel Prize in 1906, revealed how neurons transmitted signals and formed networks. This research actually advanced understanding of how consciousness emerged from physical processes. Charles Sherrington was investigating reflex arcs and neural integration, showing how complex behaviors emerged from coordinated neural activity. His research established foundational principles of neuroscience and earned him the Nobel Prize in 1932. Ivan Pavlov was demonstrating how learning modified neural responses through conditioning. His work revealed mechanisms by which experience shaped consciousness and behavior. He received the Nobel Prize in 1904. These researchers advanced knowledge through rigorous methodology, proper controls, replicable experiments, and theoretical frameworks consistent with established science. They made discoveries that transformed understanding of consciousness, learning, and neural function. Their work formed the foundation for modern neuroscience. MacDougall's experiments, by contrast, contributed nothing to scientific understanding. They advanced no theory, resolved no question, generated no further research. They represented a dead end, a methodological failure that served only as a cautionary tale about confirmation bias and inadequate experimental design. The tragedy of Duncan MacDougall is not that he failed scientifically. Many researchers pursue hypotheses that prove incorrect. Scientific progress depends on testing ideas, including ideas that ultimately fail. The tragedy is that MacDougall never recognized his failure, never acknowledged the methodological problems, never accepted that his fundamental premise was incoherent. He spent nearly 2 decades defending experiments that were indefensible. He insisted on conclusions that the evidence could not support. He claimed to have demonstrated what he had not demonstrated and likely could not demonstrate given the conceptual confusion underlying his entire project. This represents a failure not just of methodology, but of scientific thinking itself. Good scientists change their minds when evidence contradicts their hypotheses. They recognize when initial assumptions were wrong. They acknowledge methodological limitations and interpretive uncertainty. MacDougall did none of these things. He remained convinced until his death that he had weighed the soul, that science had vindicated spiritual traditions, that his critics simply misunderstood his methods. This inflexibility, this inability to accept negative results or acknowledge fundamental errors is what separates pseudoscience from legitimate scientific investigation. Science progresses through self-correction, through rejection of ideas that fail testing, through acceptance that cherished hypotheses might be wrong. Pseudoscience persists through confirmation bias, through ad hoc explanations for contradictory evidence, through unwillingness to accept that core assumptions might be flawed. MacDougall's experiments demonstrate all the hallmarks of pseudoscience: small sample sizes, lack of controls, confirmation bias in interpretation, unfalsifiable hypotheses, rejection of criticism without engagement with substantive objections, claims that far exceed what evidence supports. Yet the experiments also reveal something about human nature and our relationship with mortality. We want evidence that death is not final. We want scientific validation for beliefs about consciousness transcending physical existence. We want to believe that we are more than biological machines that cease functioning at death. These desires are not irrational or foolish. They reflect deep human concerns about meaning, purpose, and our place in the universe. The problem arises when these desires override critical evaluation of evidence, when hope displaces rigor, when we accept poor science because it tells us what we want to hear. Duncan MacDougall tried to photograph the soul, to capture in measurement and weight what philosophers and theologians had debated for millennia. He failed. His experiments were methodologically flawed, theoretically incoherent, and scientifically meaningless. But his failure illuminated important truths about how we understand consciousness, about the limits of empirical investigation when applied to metaphysical questions, about how cultural beliefs persist despite scientific rejection, about the dangers of confirmation bias in research, and about the very human desire to find objective evidence for subjective hopes. The 21 grams that never existed, the weight loss that represented evaporation rather than soul departure, the experiments that convinced no scientist but captivated popular imagination, these became MacDougall's legacy. Not the scientific validation he sought, but a cautionary tale about what happens when methodology serves belief rather than investigation, when results are interpreted to confirm rather than test hypotheses, when emotional investment overrides critical evaluation. In the end, MacDougall's experiments measured exactly what Augustus Clarke said they measured: water evaporating from a cooling corpse. The soul, if it exists, remained beyond the reach of scales calibrated for material substance. Consciousness, whether transcendent or emergent, could not be captured in fractions of ounces or photographed through weight measurements. The man who tried to photograph the soul succeeded only in photographing his own misunderstanding of what souls, if they exist, might be. And in that failure lies the entire story of why some questions, no matter how important, may not be answerable through the methods we wish to apply to them.